Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and thank you once again for stopping by. It's been a busy period recently, and I actually had two videos I was going to put together, but I can't get enough of the information I need for the second one. So that's just going to have to sit here and go and talk to a few people. And I think it would be interesting information for people who are interested in buying homes. Now, in this particular one, I'm looking at something else, and I've also been checking it out in some more detail and statistics recently. One of the things that a mistake that frequently people make is that they assume that they can time the Panamanian market. Now, during the great crisis, the financial crisis, really reached a peak, and our feeling of it here in 2009, but had started earlier than that. In this particular instance, the decision on the part of a lot of people down here was that because the Americans, seen as the largest single market for this type of purchase, were in major league trouble and their market was collapsing, that the Panama market would collapse right along with it. That made no sense to me at all, because I'd pointed out many times to people, Americans were a minority group amongst those who come in to live here, and they're also a minority group of those who purchase considered expat-level housing, for lack of a better term. It really quite a wide range, and that's true for many others. However, that was in people's minds. So a lot of people followed the advice, and the advice was in Yahoo groups, so it was the big thing back then. Now it's Facebook, pretty much, and things like that, a lot of others. But the Yahoo groups, people were saying, don't buy now, wait 3 months, 4 months, 6 months. We'll be able to get 30, 40, 50, 60% discounts because they won't be able to sell these things. The American market has collapsed. It's going to be right down here in Panama too. And people who weren't American believed that, and Panamanians, many of them believed that as well. And I'm sitting there saying, I just don't see this as happening. But it's unfolding, so I stayed away from it pretty much as an issue. And then, but it worked out a little bit differently. What happened, in fact, was that prices did not collapse, period. In the city, in fact, in some areas, they rose during this period. And along the beach area, they weren't as overbuilt and overpriced as they are today. But anyhow, it wasn't that terrible. I don't remember anything terrible about it. And out in the far west, that was a little more difficult. That's where it was hurt, because they are dependent on retirees from North America, predominantly from the United States, as buyers. And there weren't as many of them coming down. And those who came down didn't have the money to buy, or they were much more cautious about how much they were going to spend. You see, the earlier group had come in, it had been cheaper. They had bought, and they had great plans and great hopes for making a major profit when they sold. The group coming in later was either didn't have that much money, wasn't willing to spend that much money, I should say, or they just were not interested in getting into a hot market because they'd just been burned terribly by their own hot market. It was mixed, and I saw a confidential report, very detailed. A lot of hard work went into it in real estate. One of the very rare times I've ever seen anybody do that here, of what was going on, and it was very clear. The people who were selling were asking far too much money for the market. People who were buying were not going to do it, and that was all there was to it. So that market was frozen. But otherwise, especially in the city, things were actually better. Why? And it took a long time for this to sink into people. People in real estate began to understand. They could see it. They could see it unfold. I could see it unfold. Later on, I would be, in 2012, I would be talking to a group of investors. Actually, it was 2013. And I showed them some statistics to try to explain to them what went on. It's very difficult to know who's coming in to buy, normally. But one thing you can look at is an indicator, potentially, when there's a major shift going on. And that is arrivals at Tocumen International Airport, which I follow. I have for years and years and years. if you see a major increase in some nations' numbers, there's got to be a reason for that, and that's what you want to know. And it can be mundane reasons, like they now have a direct flight here, but that normally is not going to make that big an increase. Actually, not much at all. They're just coming directly instead of coming through some other city. But still, you keep an eye on the whole affair, and if you had back then, you would have seen exactly what happened. And so I'm going to show you the statistics. There are two countries that had always been the leading countries for supplying people were the United States of America and Colombia. Our next-door neighbors, and formerly were, of course, part of Colombia. So this, by standard operating procedure, they were there. So let's see, in 2009 was when we really felt the crunch here. The stock market reached a low up in the United States, for example, and all sorts of terrible things were happening. So let's take a look at it. I call it the Venezuelan surge, as you can see. That was number 3. Look at them down there in 2007 and 2008. Nothing terribly exciting down there. Very small numbers. And you can see that from 2008 to 2009, they went from 34,000 of them to over 162,000. Shot right up to the ceiling. That, my friends, was the beginning of the what I call the diaspora, the departure from Venezuela of so many Venezuelans. You will often hear people say it was 2014 or 2015. No, it wasn't. That's just when they started to count. It actually had started earlier than that, and we were very much aware of that here in Panama. And here they were, bam, walked right in the door, and they were serious people. And they were the Venezuelans more likely to have money at that time. And so they were, and they were seriously concerned. They were really making serious decisions. That's why so many showed up. And they bought homes. And they were responsible. They just easily replaced the Americans, Canadians, anybody else whose numbers were down. And they gave a huge boost to the market. And you can see that in 2010, 2011, although they fell a little in 10, they came back in 11. I mean, the point is we now had 3 large groups, 3 nations with large groups of people arriving, as opposed to the traditional 2. And Venezuela became a major factor in the market here. Now that has changed over the years and so on, because most Venezuelans who could afford to do that have done it a long time ago, and not only here, but to the United States and a number of other countries as well. But there you go. If you had been watching the statistics, you would have looked at this and said to yourself, you can't have that big a jump without there being a very good reason for it. Well, we knew what the reason was. They were trying to get away from the Chavez regime. And that's, of course, why. But they liked Panama. It was nearby. It was easy for them to get to. There was the free trade zone where people could actually set their businesses up. Venezuelans could set up businesses and run them from there, even though they still had a business in Venezuela and people down there working. In many ways, it was easier for them to get stuff done up here. All sorts of things were going on. And so they were the real estate market in some parts of the city, I'd say, for some months there. That tells you something. So that's why I continue to watch it. Now I'm going to bring you up to date. Now we're going to take a little look at what has been going on in the past here and see if there's anything that's indicative of a change in this market from that period of time. And there has been. Now, I'm going to show you the first one. Okay. The difference here is I'm going to be comparing North America and Europe. And North America in Panama is Canada, the United States, and Mexico. I use Mexico as part of Latin America, and so it's just the U.S. and Canada as North America here. Europe is all of Europe. It's not just the EU. So the UK and others, are all included, Switzerland and so forth. You can see in 2010, and I'm using 2019 because that was the last normal year. You can see there has been an increase in the number of North Americans coming up, but the real dramatic increase has been Europeans. Now people will say, oh, but there are more direct flights from Europe. That's true. But again, that is not the reason necessarily for this increase. It's a very large increase. It makes you want to know why nearly triple the people are coming, whereas the increase for the U.S. was more like 45% or something like that. It's really very, very interesting. So fair enough. That's 2010 and 2019, but it gives you a hint of what I already had been watching and wondering about and had been talking about to friends here in real estate, and people really weren't responding much to it. Okay, now let's look at a very difficult year. Let's look at last year, which was 2020. Let me get those up. Okay. As you can see, January and February were pretty impressive. March wasn't actually too bad. It's on that slope somewhere. April was a disaster. Okay. And so through this, and then we begin to see September, actually October, November, December. Think of the first 3 months the first two are normal, and the third one is down, but still not outrageous. And the last 3 months we see a slow increase. Now that's about an 80% drop, though, from its top to its from January to December. And so very clearly, no question about it. And who would expect otherwise? You know, most of the flights, a few there were in the middle of the year, were humanitarian flights, or they were bringing in supplies or one thing or another. Freights had nothing to do with passenger traffic. Now, let's take these are the total from everybody. So let's just break out those from North America and those from Europe. Okay. Now, in this case, Europe is the red line, and North America is the blue line. This is what caught my attention. That's very recently, because they're just bringing out these statistics now. We didn't have them earlier. And when I looked down there, and I said, oh, guess what? And not only on the left-hand side, you'll see that the Europeans were still right, up there, close to the North Americans at least. But in the latter part, they actually exceeded North Americans at time. If indeed you took Canadians out of the picture, Europeans, because they're a relatively small percentage of the total, maybe 10% of the total, you find that Europeans outnumbered Americans, definitely, during this last period. Now, I stop and I look at that and I say, what's going on here? It's just not a matter of there being more flights, because there aren't. There have been very few. The point is these are folks, and I've been talking to them, so I can assure you they have told me it's a pain in the ass to get from Europe to Panama. It's not a walk in the park. It's just really challenging. Talk about trying to get a test within 48 hours of arrival here. It's one thing from Miami or New York. It's another thing entirely when you're coming from Rome. I mean, and you don't have a direct flight. So it's not easy. And they are going to the trouble and the expense at this point in time, and having to go through all the hassles one has to go through when you have to keep changing planes, and you have to go through various sanitary requirements, and you have long layovers and it's elsewhere in Europe because there's so many fewer flights today, and on and on and on. They go through all that and to come here. Okay, I believe that. Absolutely. I can understand it entirely, and that's what I was thinking when I saw the numbers. And that's what I'm now hearing from at least some of those who have come in from Europe. Folks, this is just interesting. That's all. I'm not saying anything too terribly dramatic at this point, but it's the first time since I arrived 17 years ago where anything like this has happened. And it's still very early, and these are partial stats, but I cannot come up with a good reason why Europeans should be outnumbering North Americans at this stage, the last few months of last year, let's put it that way. Now, it may be all sorts of self-out. We go back to normal by now. And I will find that out when those statistics become available in the next few months. But it interests me, and I will be talking a little bit more about it again because it's very interesting to see the countries they're coming from in Europe. And it's not what you might think. So it's a much broader spread than was typically true in the past. And anyhow, I could go on, but I'm not going to. I'm just saying to you, I look at this and I say, this could be important or not. This could be a major impact. I know one person from, I can say, Eastern Europe, and leave it at that. She picked up 5 places. I've told her, I haven't met her. I just heard about her from a friend who knew her and met her. And she picked up 5 condos down on the Coronado area, which I think is pretty risky in a sense, but that's all right. And she got a really super discount, so that was good. And I thought to myself, 5? And she's from Eastern Europe. And all I could think of is, I hope she's got people to sell them to back there, because marketing is half the battle, and that is not an area that we have done a lot of work with in terms of marketing, as far as I know. So it's all very interesting. That really grabbed my attention. Then I heard bits and pieces about other stories about Europeans coming in and buying. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. But that's why when they say we're going to time the market, and I've already seen people here in various venues and websites and what have you saying, oh, this is when it's going to happen, and this is when the market's going to hit a bottom and begin to really rise, and blah, blah, blah. To begin with, don't mess with the COVID. It can still come and smack you right in the side of the head if it feels like it. So, hang on. That it ain't over till it's over, and it ain't over yet. Okay. So, but beyond that is the fact that you can't tell. And because you're not necessarily looking at the right place for the people coming. We weren't looking for an arrival of tens and tens of thousands of Venezuelans suddenly, seemingly almost overnight, from 2008 to 2009. We were just really taken by surprise. And delighted, very happy to sell them homes and condos and everything else, or rent for that matter. So, we're not going to be unhappy if Europeans decide to play a part of that role too. It's not that they're necessarily going to get the boost that Venezuelans did. It's a different set of circumstances. So you wait and see what happens. But the fact of the matter is they may give an added boost, and they may help to increase the recovery of the market when the time comes. If they're willing to come under these or the circumstances of the last 3 months of last year, well, we may be seeing something significant or not. So I just follow it. I'll let you know. Now that I've mentioned it, I normally don't mention these things because then people make all sorts of assumptions, and they'll say, Bob Adams says the Europeans are going to be the biggest buyers, and relax. I say to them and say, no, I'm just sharing this with you because this is where I'm at. I wait for stats, and I see, and I'm not in any terribly great hurry. But for you, I say this, it's a positive sign. And there's nothing negative about it. Have major increases from countries that had not been particularly large or as large in the past. So I wanted to share that with you as a little two things. One is this business of timing the market. And secondly, and I think equally important, what I've often said here is you're not all from North America. Many of you are from Europe. I know that very, very well, as I was reminded of it several times this last week. And you're every bit as important to me as anybody else. And so likewise those from Asia, Africa, and everywhere else. So that's what I wanted to share with you, and maybe that's a little food for thought. And I will be back with some talk about financing in my next video. Just a very quick note to you. The reason for the delay in my newsletter, which I'm sure has been rather frustrating for some of you, at least so I hear, it is going to be coming to an end, and I'm going to get this darn thing out. What happened is that so much has been going on that my analysis has had to shift, and as it always does, to accept new information and to respond to it. So as a result, there are changes made in my outlook, and that in turn affects the newsletter. It only comes out 2 or 3 times a year, So when I do it, I want to make it as up to date as I can when it's done. So that's what's happening, and it will come out. And if you've subscribed at retirementwave.com, you're going to automatically get it. If you haven't, it will be announced here, and then you'll have an opportunity then. But I did want to let you know that. Thank you very much once again for stopping by.